Welcome to another edition of Journey of Hope. Stories of people and their journey through life. Our special guest today is Bill Aaron, a cancer survivor who's been on an amazing journey making an impact upon thousands of cancer patients. Bill, it's good to have you here.
Thank you, Lynn.
We've got people from all around the world that are watching this, and we want to learn a little bit about you. So, where did you start out?
When I was 9 years old, my mother took me to Atlantic City and Steel Pier, which is a pier by the ocean, and they had all sorts of games of chance around. And so I'm walking around, I'm all by myself, and I take a nickel out of my pocket and I put it down on number 48 of the roulette wheel. And
a roulette wheel, and they spin it.
Big wheel.
A nickel.
Guy spins it, a nickel. He spins it, goes around, and it lands on 48. Couldn't believe it. So the guy looks at me, little 9-year-old kid, and he takes down this big teddy bear and goes to hand it to me. And I said, no, I don't want that, I want that. And I pointed to this camera. And it was a Brownie Hawkeye camera. And that was my first camera. No
kidding. So were you raised back in New York then? Or?
I was raised in Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia. Yeah. Okay. And then where did you go to school? Did you graduate from high school in that area? Or?
I did. Central High School, Philadelphia, class of 211. And then I went to the University of Pennsylvania.
And what were you taking in school there at the university?
My major was Near Eastern Studies.
Really? Near Eastern Studies, all right. And you've been on quite a journey then.
I did.
From Near Eastern Studies, what were you planning on doing when you finished?
Well, I realized that the only thing you can do with a BA in Near Eastern Studies is to go on and get a PhD in Near Eastern Studies. Decided I didn't want to do that, so I went into the Peace Corps.
You went in the Peace Corps?
And I was stationed in Turkey, and at the end of that, they asked me to stay on the staff for 2 more years, and I did that. After that, I went back to study sociology at the University of Chicago.
Okay. And what were you taking there?
I got my PhD at the University of Chicago in 1972, and then came out to California to what was then Camarillo State Hospital, north of LA.
Okay.
In Camarillo, and I headed the research and evaluation program for 3 drug rehabilitation programs that were being run at the hospital.
Now, were you married at this time?
I got married in '73, and I worked at the hospital from '72 to '74.
And your wife also has a doctorate, if I remember correctly.
She does. At that time, she was writing her dissertation.
Okay. So, were you pretty excited about the work you were involved in with your doctorate? You got kind of frustrated?
I have to tell you that, I was research, and it was my job to write articles, which I did do, that were published in the journals. And I gradually came to realize that the only people reading my articles were other researchers who were looking for things to cite in their own articles. And that we know an awful lot about drug addiction. We know about the process of addiction. And if there were a social will, which means a budget, we could go a long way towards curing hardcore drug addicts.
So you weren't really fulfilled in your work then?
Not at all. My wife and I had a very good friend, Frida Fo Shen, who was living with us at the time. And she was studying to be an actress.
And she was a long-term friend of your wife? She went to school together or something?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, they went to college together.
All right.
And I would come home from the hospital, and I would complain about this or that. So finally one day, Frida says to me, well, what do you like to do? So I said, oh, I like photography. And she said, well, do you have a camera? Other than my Brownie Hawkeye, I didn't have anything. So I said no, and so the next day she took me to a membership department store, which was at that time called Fedco.
Yep, I remember Fedco.
Yeah, and she helped me buy my first camera.
Really? She wanted to know what you were interested in?
Yes.
She knew that you weren't interested in the work you were doing.
Right.
It was coming out every day, frustration, and kind of an endless job. So she took you down and helped you buy a camera.
She helped me buy a camera, and she said, good, now you have a hobby, something you like to do. So I took a class, I learned how to process film, how to make prints, and at the hospital I had a dark room, so I would practice there. It stayed on that level. Took a lot of pictures, developed a lot.
Kind of a hobby, took a few classes, you know a little bit about it, okay?
Yeah, about the fundamentals.
And then something took you back east again.
That's correct. A fellow at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, he was a postdoctoral fellow in a program there in the role of the professional in the social change process. So I thought that would be a good avenue to investigate for me, something useful that could influence.
You might be able to
have
go
an
somewhere
impact.
with it,
Yeah.
okay?
So I went back for actually both my wife and myself won this postdoc. This was in 74 to 76. And we went back to New York, and during that time, I just did a lot of photography.
All as a hobby.
All as a hobby. My placement for the fellowship where I was working was for an organization called Project Ezra on the Lower East Side of New York. And so I was photographing the old Jewish immigrant community there. And
These are all black and white?
all black and white. I was making large 16 by 20 inch prints, which for that time was quite large. And it was great. I would work at this organization, I think 2 days a week, and the rest of the time I was out photographing or going to a seminar at the fellowship. And I just kept going. And at the end of those 2 years, I decided that I really wasn't interested in pursuing sociology or anything in it for the rest of my life. So I decided to take a year off to figure out
what you wanted to do. How old are you at this point?
74 to 76, so I'm 35.
Okay, you're 35.
35.
You got to do something. You got a doctoral, you were doing on some postdoctoral work, and you're kind of frustrated, and so you decided to take a year off just to figure out what you wanted to do.
Yes. And first thing I figured out was that I could not do nothing, that I had to be involved in doing something with my time.
You got restless after a period of time.
Right. It just wasn't enough to go walk along the Hudson River and
Be
think
thinking
about me.
Yeah. Some guys can do that, but yeah, I don't think I could either.
No.
So you decided, what were you going to do then?
I started photographing. I started
Still
off,
as a hobby.
Well, at this point, it was a little more than a hobby, or I was beginning to see it as a little more than a hobby. I would go to organizations and volunteer to shoot for them, to make photographs of what they needed in their organization.
Free work for them.
Yeah, free. And then after a while, people began to get to know me, and I had got the head of the Jewish Museum in New York, a woman named Susan Goodman, had given me, I'm sorry, she was the chief curator, had given me some positive feedback on my work and told me that I should continue in this vein. I was in a camera club with 7, 8 other people. We'd get together once a week and critique each other's photographs, and I was actually enjoying it a lot. And at the end of that year, I decided, well, let me see what I can do with this for a year. And during the next year, I was extremely lucky. I was hired by a magazine called Moment Magazine. And they wanted to do a feature story on a family by the name of, Bernie and Sue Pucker, who owned a gallery in downtown Boston on Newbury Street.
Prominent Jewish people?
Prominent Jewish family.
Okay.
And their gallery at that time was called the Pucker Safrai Gallery. They had an allegiance with Safrai Gallery in Jerusalem. I spent a weekend with them. I photographed them jogging. I photographed them at work, with their family. They had 3 wonderful children. And at the end of which, I asked Bernie, who was running the gallery, if he had exhibited any photographers. And he said, excuse me, he said he didn't really understand photography, so he hadn't explored it. So I asked him to look at my photographs. So he came on his next trip to New York to acquire purchases for his gallery. He came over and I showed him the prints, and he said he'd like to take the prints back to the gallery to see what he could do with them.
So that was kind of a start. Now, He didn't have that great of appreciation for that kind of photography, but he thought he'd give it a try. So he takes them back to the gallery, and what happens?
Extremely serendipitous, good fortune. There was a group from the International B'nai B'rith organization that was touring all the galleries on Newbury Street.
This is a worldwide organization.
Worldwide Jewish organization. Right. They happened to be in the gallery just at the time when the box of my prints was brought in from the truck. And the owner of, or the gallery director began going through the prints to catalog them, that, they were received. And as they were going through the prints, this group of maybe 15, 20 people just all gathered around the gallery director and started looking. And they sold 5 prints on the spot.
Just like that.
Just like that.
So you're a professional.
Right. Well,
No
at
kidding.
the end of that year, I thought, well, gee, I have gallery representation now. Why don't I do this for another year? And after a while, Lynn, as you probably know, it's not that you burn your bridges. Just at some point, you turn around and they're not there.
They're not there. You move on. That's right.
Yeah.
So, Bill, you've become a worldwide famous photographer.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't happen overnight. Now, what was the first project you really got involved in? You were taking some pictures there of New York, you were telling me?
I was. The Lower East Side of New York is an old Jewish immigrant community. And I was photographed. They have scribes who, by hand, write the long Torah scrolls that Jews read every weekend and sometimes during the week in the synagogue. They had Tallis factory, the prayer shawls, the factories that make the prayer shawls the Jews wear. Gus's pickles, pickles famous throughout the world.
No kidding.
Katz's Deli.
Yeah.
So I was having fun while I was working during that first 2 years in New York, photographing on the street. My work, I only had to work there 2 days a week. So the rest of the time, pretty much I was out there. Photography.
Then you got involved in a project down in Cuba.
I did. There was brief thaw in the Carter administration, 1978, when Cuba and the United States actually started to talk to each other. And the UN, the head of the UN, the Cuban legation at the UN, invited a group of Jews to come visit the Jewish community in Havana. So when I heard about that, I jumped at the chance and went there.
Then you told me you were over in Russia at one point.
I was in the former Soviet Union,
Yes.
Russia, in 1981. And that was quite an experience of visiting community members who are living under an oppressive regime. The people that I visited were called refuseniks, because they had applied to leave the Soviet Union to go either to Israel or the United States, and they were refused by the government for reasons of state security, which was just something trumped up.
Yeah, and you came out with a book.
And I came out, well, at that point, I had also been photographing in, of course, New York and Los Angeles, where I had moved to, and it struck me that there were a lot of books about Jewish communities, but nothing about 5 Jewish communities: Russia, Cuba, New York, Los Angeles, and Jerusalem. So,
well, I have a book here, and we're going to get into it, but this book called New Beginnings. And before we get to that book and how you got about it, tell me about your cancer, because that's what led to this whole thing.
Absolutely. In 1993, I was diagnosed with early onset prostate cancer, and I had a Gleason of 8 or 9, depending on which
aggressive.
lab. Very aggressive. There was no internet, certainly, that I had access to, so I would go to medical libraries, and everything I found in the library, of course, was write-ups of cases, and they were exceptional cases, exceptionally bad cases.
Bad outcomes.
Outcomes. And I came away extremely depressed. And I had surgery. The surgery failed. And I went through a long process of just trying to come to terms with that. And
it makes quite an impact on you when you have cancer, and then you had a more aggressive cancer, and apparently had surgery, and that didn't work well. Okay? So you're hearing the clock of mortality ticking.
I think that's what cancer does best.
Yes.
It makes us come to terms with mortality, with our limitations, and also with our strengths. And I saw a very gifted therapist, a woman named Michael, who helped me understand these kinds of issues. And I found out from other cancer survivors that there is this sense of those people who continue living regardless of the state of their disease. There's this sense of wanting to give back to the cancer community. And I gradually became aware of those feelings. And I thought I would like to do the kind of book that I wish had existed when I was diagnosed.
And that's what this book is. New Beginnings. 120 cases of cancer survivors. Right. And it came about as a result of the experience you went through.
Yes, absolutely.
And you had failed surgery, and then you tried some alternative things, and apparently it's under control right now. But this prompted you to make contact. And I remember it was Rabbi Douglas Cohn that I had developed a friendship with, and interviewed him on this program, and I think he put you in touch with me. And we had you come over because I know there's 7 or 8 of the people that I got acquainted with that are in this book here. But tell us about this 120 survivors. First of all, how did they get this book if somebody wanted to get it?
Amazon.com is the easiest place.
Okay.
Local bookstores should be carrying it, and if people go in and they don't have it, I hope they yell at the bookstore and tell them to get it.
All right, 120 Survivors by Bill Aaron, and it's hot off the press. It's only been out for the last couple of weeks.
April 14th was the publication.
And I know I've talked to a number of the cancer patients right now. I happen to be listed in here. I appreciate your honoring me with that and selecting me. But it's an amazing story. So what did you learn from this project as you've been dealing with all these people?
First of all, I was totally taken back by the fact that every person I visited that I interviewed and photographed was exceedingly nice. These are, what turned out in the book, there are 120 people that I would love to have for my close friends. There's something about the cancer experience that calms the soul and makes us see ourselves in the real world, I believe, as we are, not as we want to be or as we think we should be. That was my first revelation. Next, I think that Rabbi Ed Feinstein said it best. He talks about angels in everyday life, not the kinds of angels that live in the clouds and have gossamer wings and that, we pray to, but angels are everyday people who in our worst moments appear to us and help us through those moments. And he then says that his goal of life has become to be one of those angels for other people.
For other people.
Yes.
Now, have you encountered some of those angels?
I actually have. This woman that I mentioned before, Frida, she also showed up at my house after I was diagnosed. She had gone to the health food store and bought every book on cancer and diet, because she knew I had a terrible diet, and gave them, just deposited them on my doorstep. And while I was recuperating from surgery, I went through them. And the books on macrobiotics made the most sense to me. And I actually changed. I went to Johnny Rockets and I had my last hamburger, and I then and there became macrobiotic.
Is that right? Oh, that's amazing. So but that's one illustration of an angel showing up. Yeah.
Yes. She is one of the major angels in my life. This woman therapist, Michael States, that I saw, she is also one of my angels.
Well, it sounds like the lady that took you over to Fedco and bought your camera was functioning like an angel there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Frida Foshen, wonderful woman.
Talking about these 120 survivors, and the foreword is by Jane Brody. Who's Jane?
Jane Brody is the health columnist for the New York Times.
Okay.
And I've read her column for years. She talks a lot about personal health issues. And I sent her an email, and she very kindly wrote back, said she usually doesn't do this kind of thing, but she just might for this. So she
Special
did.
project.
Yeah.
So, this has been going on for a number of years. I mean, I think I talked to you 4, 5, 6 years ago. How long were you working on the project?
I started in 2006.
2006.
And this is at the same time where doing this alongside my photography career, my commercial business. And 2006, and then 2007 and 2008, probably I did the majority of the work for this. 6 to 7, I had to raise some money because there were, expenses for equipment and assistance.
Travel
and travel. And then I became more selective. I started to find.
You probably had hundreds of people that were volunteered.
I still have a folder that's this thick of people that I could have continued with. The first people I interviewed were people given to me by the what was then the wellness community in Los Angeles, now called the Cancer Support Community, a free service for anyone diagnosed with cancer, of support groups and educational seminars and various kinds of classes. And then as I neared 100, I found my publisher and said that I'm going to, conclude this when I get to 100. And they said, fine. Then I got to 100. I said, well, I need some more time because there are a couple people in New York, and I'm going there, that I would like to include in the book. And I said, okay. And then I thought, well, there's somebody in Chicago and Miami that I'd like to see. And they said, okay. And then finally, and I sent them manuscript and updates. And finally they said, I think it's 120. We should call it quits now. Call closure.
Yeah. Well, there's 120 stories in here, and they are incredible stories. And I know when I went over to your house for the book signing, I met a number of the people there. And there are some incredible stories of people that have had cancer, or they're still fighting the cancer. But these people are they're not only survivors, they're thrivers.
Absolutely.
And I mean, they're enjoying life to the fullest. Yeah. Is there anybody in particular that shows up? I mean, you had some phenomenal food there.
Yes.
The day we were there. Who prepared that?
There were 2 people in the book, Elisa Hunziker and Lily Padilla. They both, as a result of their cancer, became chefs. They left their careers they had before, and they decided that it was very important to lead, in order to lead a healthy life, to be able to have healthy food. And they studied and became healthy chefs. So I asked them to serve the food. Let me just say one more thing. When you picked up the book, I remembered that this is a unique book because it focuses on an aspect of cancer that is pretty much ignored. And that's what this one survivor gave me the name for it. It's called the silent phase of cancer. Kim Lintz, a young woman who had adrenal cancer. When we're diagnosed and when we're in treatment, there's an incredible busyness of doctor's appointments, treatment appointments, people calling up to find out how you are. But then when treatment ends, it's seen as an end by most family and friends. And for survivors, it's really a beginning of trying to figure out what happens next. I had this experience. Okay, what do I do now? Even family and friends tend to see it as an end, but for the survivor, it's not an end, but it's the first stages of a new beginning.
That's, well, New Beginnings. That's where you got the title for the book.
Yes.
Yeah. Anybody that stands out in particular of all the people you've interviewed?
You.
Oh, wow. Well, I had, as my listening audience knows here, I had 2 different kinds of cancer. I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer back in 2003, and then 4 years later, I was diagnosed with splenic marginal zone. And it's a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Lymphomas represent about 8 or 9% of all cancers. My particular lymphoma, splenic marginal zone, is less than 1%. I always say, if you're going to get something, be special.
Yeah.
Now, we got a listening audience, Bill, and some of these people have just found out that they've got cancer. What would you tell them? Look into the camera. And what would you tell them? They've just been diagnosed. What are their options for them? They're kind of devastated. All they know, they've got cancer.
I think Lynn mentioned Doug Cohn, who's been a guest here, and he had this wonderful thing to say. He said, getting cancer is like eating of the fruit in the Garden of Eden. It lifts our eyes, it opens our eyes to the world, but it takes away our security. And I think the one thing that I found among the survivors in this book is that sense that they wanted to be their own doctors, that they weren't going to just take the advice of someone else who's going to tell them what to do, but they were going to investigate, they were going to figure out the course of action in conjunction with their doctors. It's not that they weren't not going to ignore doctors' advice, but they were going to listen and then do their own research. And I think we call that in the cancer community being patient active, taking control of your own life. And I think once you take control of your life, it gives you a power, a strength to use over your life.
Thank you, Bill. You know, for our listening audience, I know that even this week, some of you have heard the words, you have cancer. And it's devastating news when you first hear those words. But Bill, again, is another example here of people who have not only combated cancer and faced it, they're not only survivors, but they're thrivers. And this book of New Beginnings is 120 thrilling stories of people that were not only survivors, but thrivers. And Bill's work here is going to make an impact. So I encourage you to go on to Amazon and pick up the book, New Beginnings. I know it'll be a real encouragement for you and for your family. Until next week, I'm Lynn Martell with Journey of Hope. God bless you, each one.